June 14, 1944. Pier 7, Baltimore Harbor. A battered leather notebook lay open on a splintered crate as Hans Becker, corporal recently released from a transport ship, traced a finger over an entry that would have been treason if discovered back home. They had told them the enemy lived in scarcity and shadow, he wrote, yet a lighthouse of steel and light rose before him, and the harbor itself hummed like a living machine. The Americans cannot be as rich as they claim, he told himself, and then saw a refrigerated box lifted by a crane and heard, as if in answer, a metallic chorus of winches and gears that smelled faintly of salt, oil, and coffee. In the space between the roar of engines and the steam of the boilers, a simple tin cup on a bench became the emblem of a different truth the men would not abandon easily. What they had learned was propaganda, he thought, and what he was about to see would unmake beliefs older than the war. Hans Becker had been a front-line non-commissioned officer in North Africa, wounded twice, and yet nothing in his medals prepared him for the quiet violence of abundance. The story that follows will trace, with documents and testimony, how material proof of industrial might and social logistics produced a deeper conversion than bullets ever managed, how trucks and factories and hospitals reconfigured loyalties, and how that reconfiguration shaped reconstruction in ways generals had never predicted. The capture had been abrupt and messy. It was a dawn of sand and smoke when Hans and his squad realized the supply line had been severed. Men shouted orders that dissolved into static as shells found their world. In less than an hour they had been surrounded, their radios silent, boots sinking into dust. "Stand fast," the lieutenant barked, but the words meant only that they would not flee. A sequence of short sentences became a dialogue of survival as the Americans moved in with a precision that looked at first like luck and then like a system. "Hands where I can see them," said a voice, and the reply came, "We are not here to kill you." "Who are you?" "We are your captors and your cooks for now." "Will we be shot?" "No." "Then stand up." "We will follow." "You will be processed." "What does that mean?" "You will be fed and counted." "Counted for what?" "To know where to take you and how to care for you." "Will we return?" "That depends." "On what?" "On many things, but first we will make sure you are alive." The exchanges were short, clipped, ringing with the sounds of gear and the metallic clank of helmets, but they revealed an organizational logic the men had been taught to dismiss. Around them smelled diesel, gunpowder, and the copper of blood. They felt the rough canvas of sacks and the cold metal of bayonets turned into the warm brass of keys. Opened transport trucks. The presence of orderly crates of food produced a dissonant taste memory, canned peaches and sweet condensed milk that was almost obscene. That first dialogue of capture began to set a rhythm, not simply of military protocol, but of a sequence that would later be explained in documents called processing lists and hunger reports. At that moment, a young medic named Otto Mueller knelt, checked pulses, and said quietly, "They treat wounds like work orders." The phrase echoed inside the minds of men who had been fed slogans and taught that compassion was a tool to be faked. It was not a trick, it was infrastructure. In the processing lines, the shock deepened into a kind of cognitive labor. Men were given simple forms, and their names were recorded on thick index cards stamped with a numeric system that seemed endless. A nurse with a steady hand and calloused fingers, named Margaret Lawson, moved among them, offering vitamins and a slice of warm bread wrapped in wax paper. The smells in the tent were not of rot, but of disinfectant, of boiled broth, of lemon soap. Light from kerosene lamps had been replaced by electric bulbs hung on cords like constellations above wooden benches, and the hum of a generator under the tent added a new sense of permanence. Hans held out his hand when asked for it, and felt not the shake of suspicion, but the firm, clean grip of a clerk who had learned to make paper into a plan. "Name and number," the clerk said. "Becker, Hans," he managed. "Occupation?" "Mechanic." "Any wounds?" "Knee, shrapnel in the shoulder." "All right. You will see a doctor. You will eat. You will be assigned a camp."
They used words that implied continuation rather than punishment. In those words, in the bright sealed packages handed through flaps in the tent, there were proofs. A radio man named Friedrich Radke, whose hand still shook from the desert sun, sniffed the soup and wrote in his notebook, "This tastes of something I did not think I would taste again." The tent offered 5 senses of proof. They saw light that had no blackout. They heard a quiet orderliness rather than random shouting. They smelled bread. They touched clean cloth, and they tasted sustenance. The index cards, later archived, would become evidence of this transition, rows of numbers that mapped the movement of people and the reach of logistics. Please take a moment to reflect on what you have just seen and to join the conversation below. The first hours of shock and the first proofs of abundance produced a powerful emotion among the prisoners that some of you may recognize from family letters or stories. What detail surprised you most so far? The light, the food, or the orderliness of it all? Comment with one word, light, food, or order, and tell us in a sentence why it struck you. Your replies help shape future episodes where we dig into
archives and personal diaries to answer the questions you raise. We will read your comments and some of your stories may be featured in the next video. While you type, the narrative continues. We will follow these men from the processing tents to the transport ships and trains and into factories and clinics, and we will show how the accumulation of small sensory proofs produced a shift in belief so large that it altered careers and communities in the years that followed. The crossing to the mainland was a lesson in scale. A Liberty ship that had seemed to Hans from a distance like a floating warehouse became, from below the deck, a labyrinth of stacked crates and humming refrigeration units. The salt cut their throats and the spray tasted of iron. On the ramp, a steward named Thomas Reed distributed hot coffee and dry biscuits as if such things were routine currency. "You will have a bunk," he told them. "For now, you will sleep." "Are we prisoners or guests?" asked Otto with a crooked smile. "Tonight you will be sheltered," Reed replied. "Tomorrow you will be fed." "Will there be more like this?" "Thousands of miles like this." "How is it funded?" "By a country that organizes itself to feed many." "Do you fear sabotage?" "We have guards for that and procedures for that." "Who are the guards?" "Soldiers who follow orders like any other man." "Do they hate us?" "Some do, many do not. Some simply do their jobs." "Is that why you offer us coffee?" "Partly. It makes the world easier to take." The dialogue unfolded over the creak of timbers and the clang of chains, and every exchange revealed a human calculus. Kindness as stability, provision as a means to control movement without cruelty. Around them the ship recycled air through ducts that smelled of engine oil and citrus cleaner. Men who had slept on stones were given blankets and told where to line up for the latrine. A cook named Evelyn Carter showed Hans how to open a can of peaches without cutting himself, and explained with a patient tone how rations were portioned per man. Below deck the air was humid and warm, the taste of soup thick with barley, the touch of bunks scratchy but dry. The journey lasted days, and each day added to the dossier of proof. Every crate labeled hospital supplies, every roll of bandages, every ration pack stacked like bricks behind the galley increased the cognitive dissonance inside the men. The ship produced evidence of a logistical reach they had not imagined, and each item was a small argument against the stories that had sustained them. Arrival in the port city was an encounter with modernity itself. Baltimore surprised them with steamrollers, streetcars, and neon signs that seemed to wink at midnight like distant stars arranged by will. The city smelled of coal smoke and fresh bread, of wet pavement and machine oil. They saw a sky cut by the silhouette of cranes and trains, a landscape of iron framed by smoke that was industrial rather than ruinous. A customs official named Robert Hansen stamped documents with a practiced thumb and told them where to board a train. "You will pass through farms that harvest by machine," he said. "You will see factories that run around the clock." "Is that true?" Hans asked. "Yes," Hansen replied. "You will see trucks unloaded by cranes, assembly lines that build planes in weeks, hospitals that perform operations by the dozen."
Will we believe it? You will see it, and then you will have to decide. The train that carried them out of the city was a slow revelation. Through the window, they watched rows of factories sending plumes of steam into the sky, rows of houses with electric bulbs lit at dusk, and fields where tractors moved like measured beasts. The sensation built like a scale. Sight, the glare of electric light. Sound, the steady clack of rails. Smell, ozone after rain. Touch, the glass cold beneath their palms. Taste, the grainy loaf that tasted of a harvest. Otto raised a hand and touched the window as if to make sure the scene was solid. "We thought our factories were advanced," he said. "We were wrong." "They build volumes," replied Hans. "Not just for war, but for a civilian life. Does that make them better? It makes them different." "Different how?" "They made machines to feed a society, not merely to arm it. Will our leaders accept that? Some will resist." The carriage hummed, and the rhythm of the wheels became a metronome counting off a new understanding. The train journey from port to interior towns was a chapter of prolonged proof. Windows framed small miracles. Electric lights in barns, motors on tractors, schoolhouses with blackboards, canneries with lines of humming conveyors. Men leaned toward the glass, pressing their foreheads to the cold pane, tasting the steam from passing dairies and hearing a chorus of engines that signaled both industry and order. Conversations in the coaches became longer and more complex as doubts matured into questions. "How long did it take to build those factories?" asked Friedrich. "A year in some cases," said an engineer-turned-guard named James Miller. "How many men work on a single assembly line?" "Hundreds, sometimes thousands in shifts." "Are the workers trained?" "Yes, and they learn fast." "Do they strike?" "Sometimes. They negotiate. They vote." "They vote?" "Yes." "How is that possible?" "They have systems of representation." The coaches were damped with the scent of rain and the metallic tang of iron. The seats wore the imprint of prior passengers, and the air tasted faintly of coffee and tobacco. At one station they watched, stunned, as a truck carrying airplane wings was lowered by a crane with so little fuss that a laugh went round the car like a curse turned into relief. "They move mountains and call it logistics," Hans said. "We move men and call it glory." These exchanges did more than catalog facts. They introduced a comparative language, a way to hold one reality next to another and measure the difference in human terms. The camps where many prisoners were housed looked at first like military installations built to be temporary. Tents gave way to wooden barracks with bunks and tables, and rows of latrines were kept scrupulously clean. In the infirmary, a woman named Nurse Emily Carter peeled back bandages and applied penicillin with a steady rhythm that smelled faintly of antiseptic and lemon. "That will make the infection subside in days," she explained. "You will be monitored." "Will it hurt?" "Only for a moment. Then it will feel like healing." The presence of antibiotics became both a medical and symbolic revelation. The hospital recorded vitals on charts that were then transmitted to nearby field hospitals by telegraph and telephone. The smell of iodine and the feel of linen contrasted with memories of untreated wounds and makeshift sups. A doctor named Samuel Price explained processes with a precision that bordered on pedagogy. "We triage and treat and then rehabilitate," he told a skeptical group. "First, we stop the immediate risk. Then we rebuild strength." The procedure of triage was described as coordination between nurses, doctors, and clerks, and involved inventory of supplies, scheduling of operating rooms, and routing patients to rehabilitation. The explanation of the medical process was short but concrete. Take patient, assess wound, apply antibiotic, schedule follow-up, record outcome. That procedural clarity became persuasive evidence. A second technical description detailed how food was prepared. Large cauldrons cooked by coal-fired stoves. Menus rotated weekly. Rations measured by weight and caloric calculation to meet minimum standards. Each technical explanation, about 300 characters long, translated into practice the abstract idea of care. Men who had once equated hospitals with propaganda saw instead an empirical demonstration of a social choice, to treat and to record in order to prevent future loss. Memory and body responded. A moment of tension arose when a convoy miscounted beds and a man named Wilhelm Schultz was turned away at night and forced to sleep under a tarp while rain chilled him to the bone. He recalled the damp on his skin and a fear that returned like an old enemy. He considered escape, then remembered the steady hand of Nurse Carter and returned to the line the next morning. That choice between flight and reliance became an internal test of whether the proofs before them were temporary or structural. Work details and education programs completed the transformation from prisoner to participant. At a factory near a city named Willow Run, the men watched assembly lines move with a cadence that resembled a heartbeat. Tools were passed, rivets set, wings bolted, and at each station an instructor spoke with authority and patience. "We teach you to work safely," said a foreman named Charles Avery. "We teach you to read a drawing." "Why teach us?"
asked Hans. "So you can be useful where you go," Avery replied. "So you can rebuild." Is this forced labor? It is structured labor in a camp that provides food and shelter. Do we get paid? You are rationed and given small cash allowances in some cases. Can we learn trades? Yes, carpentry, welding, machining, electrical work. Will these skills help us later? They will become the tools of reconstruction. The smell of hot metal and oil filled the workspace. The taste of sweat and hot coffee was constant. The touch of metal on the palms was a lesson in contact memory. The sound of pneumatic drills was a percussion that organized time. And the sight of planes half assembled on jigs made an argument about capacity. Educational programs were formalized in the camp with schedules and syllabi and included language classes, basic engineering, and civic lectures about municipal governance. A librarian named Evelyn Howard ran a small library where men could borrow books on mechanics and agriculture. The process of training was described step by step, including curricula, instructor-to-student ratios, and the certification process that could be transferred to civilian job registries. The presence of these programs, combined with visible production numbers on wall charts that announced shifts and output, created a systematic argument. The capacity to produce was tied to the capacity to educate and rebuild. Names circulated. Hans Becker, who welded and later taught others. Otto Müller, who became a mechanic at a transit workshop. Friedrich Rodke, who took night classes in civics. Wilhelm Schultz, who became a foreman. Charles Avery, the foreman. Nurse Emily Carter, the caregiver. Dr. Samuel Price, the physician. Librarian Evelyn Howard, the educator. Each name represented a node in a network that transformed survival into reconstruction. Moments of tension occurred in concentrated bursts and altered the course of many small lives. The first major tension came when an alarm revealed a miscount and the camp was ordered to stand to in the night. Hans remembered the chill of the tent canvas and the metallic taste of panic. He thought of deserters and of accusations that might be levied. The memory that surfaced was of his brother who had been court-martialed years earlier. He had to decide whether to run with others when a hole was spotted in the fence, or to remain and face uncertain procedure. He chose to stay, a decision that later allowed him to be counted in a work program that taught him welding. The second tension involved a labor dispute at the factory, where a strike rumor spread and the camp administration threatened to withdraw privileges. The memory was of hunger and of a kitchen where they had once gone without. And the decision was to vote on whether to support a walkout that might return them to uncertainty. They chose to remain at work after a negotiation that increased the small allowances for those at risk. The third tension was medical and personal. A man named Ernst Vogel developed a fever, and the question was whether to transfer him to a field hospital far from the camp or to keep him close.
Nurse Carter advocated transfer, Dr. Price weighed the logistics, and the final decision saved Ernst, but not without leaving a scar of doubt about previous medical promises. Each moment of tension lasted in memory like a condensed scene, a pair of paragraphs that held a past, a present decision, and a future consequence. These compressions of fear and choice were crucial to the transformation because they forced individuals to reconcile prior propaganda with new institutional realities. As weeks turned into months, the cumulative effect of proofs, of work, and of care began to change internal narratives. Men who had arrived certain of enemy scarcity began to catalog evidence and to carry pages of reality back in their notebooks. They wrote letters, sometimes in secret, sometimes aloud by censors, and these letters described not simply survival, but learning. Hans wrote to a cousin about the lathe he had learned to use, about the taste of fresh milk, about the dignity of being given a bench rather than a bare floor. Otto wrote about a class on municipal governance that taught him how a city budget was balanced. Friedrich sent a postcard with a crude drawing of an assembly line and a single sentence beneath: "They build more than weapons." These small texts circulated, and when men returned to Europe after the war, many brought skills and models that would inform Reconstruction policies. The factories ran on schedules, the hospitals kept logs, and the schools had syllabi that were adapted to train returning citizens in practical trades. The connection between material abundance and ideological shift was not instantaneous. It was a slow accretion of proofs to which people attached meaning through work and testimony. The technical details of logistics matter to the story because they show how simple processes became persuasive arguments. For instance, rationing was not arbitrary but calculated. A camp kitchen used measured portions derived from caloric requirements, and stuffed foods were rotated on a weekly cycle to prevent deficiencies. The feeding schedule was recorded and adjusted according to labor intensity. Similarly, hospital triage followed a 5-step protocol from initial assessment to scheduled follow-up and rehabilitation, ensuring continuity of care and measurable outcomes. These procedural explanations show that what seemed like generosity was often an organized method to stabilize populations and to transform them into productive citizens. 1 month later, life inside the camps had settled into routines that felt to many like an alternative normal. Men who had once relied on rumor and doctrine began to keep time by factory whistles and meal times, rather than by orders shouted across a desert. The initial shock had passed into habit. Hans had been assigned to a metal shop where he learned welding and later supervised a small crew. He kept a notebook that recorded hours and tasks, and slowly his handwriting became neat, a physical sign of a mind reoriented toward craft. Letters reached families with descriptions that oscillated between longing and surprising detail about classes attended and friends made. The camp had a small council that included representatives elected by the prisoners to voice basic needs. That council, although limited in scope, was a form of quotidian democracy that contrasted sharply with the centralized propaganda they had known. Men began to describe their experience as an education in civic life rather than punishment. The sensory palette of daily life seemed to confirm this change. Bread that was once rare became a steady staple. Lights allowed reading at night, and the sound of tools replaced the higher-pitched panic of combat. Small economic actions followed. Some men were allowed to work on local farms and received small cash allowances that they saved or used to buy small comforts. The psychological change was measurable in letters and in the choices men made to take classes. 3 months later, several of those who had learned trades were offered positions in civilian factories under supervised contracts pending repatriation. Hans received an offer to remain for 6 months to teach welding to new recruits, and he faced a choice between returning home to an uncertain town and staying in a place that paid modestly and offered a skill. The idea of staying was foreign to his original identity, but the reality of steady income and the pride of workmanship reshaped his considerations. A cluster of men who chose to stay formed informal cooperatives that repaired agricultural equipment and, in the months that followed, helped mechanize local farms. Their letters home began to use new vocabulary: industry, logistics, public health, reconstruction. Former soldiers who had once defined valor by endurance now described it in terms of productive contribution. This shift had larger consequences. Communities in devastated regions that received returning men with practical skills rebuilt faster, adopted mechanized tools, and gradually shifted from subsistence patterns to small-scale industrial agriculture. The experiential learning inside the camps translated into technical transfer. 6 months after arrival, the long-term effects of the conversion were visible. A registry kept by the occupation authorities documented that among the prisoners processed and released, a significant portion opted into vocational programs and some into civic training. The numbers suggested that material experience altered ideological commitments. Where propaganda had promised moral superiority, material reality offered alternatives. Schools that trained mechanics, hospitals that taught sanitation, factories that created jobs. Hans returned to a city that was scarred but eager to learn. He brought with him a list of contacts, a set of welding stamps, and the habit of keeping a ledger. He reunited with a brother who had survived, and together they opened a small repair shop that became a node of reconstruction in their town. The broader statistic did not capture every personal transformation, but it encapsulated the scale of the phenomenon. Tens of thousands processed, many trained, and a measurable uptick in reconstruction.
Projects led by returnees. The final synthesis is stark. The force multiplier in this story was not just military victory, but logistical demonstration. The evidence produced by industrial capacity and organized care did something that artillery could not do. It offered a tangible template for a different social order. Men who had been taught to believe in scarcity and authoritarian control encountered instead routines of provision and participation. They arrived as prisoners of war and left as carriers of practices, teachers of trades and witnesses to an industrial model that could be adapted to rebuild their world. The statistical frame closes the narrative with clarity. A processing system that handled triple-digit thousands, a factory output measured in dozens of aircraft per day in peak months, and camp programs that taught hundreds of tradesmen and technicians who later contributed to local reconstruction. These numbers do not erase the violences and injustices of war, but they do explain a paradox. Abundance administered as policy became an instrument of reconciliation and conversion. If you were moved by how simple objects like a tin cup or a train window could reshape ideas, share which image stayed with you in the comments. If you want to explore the documents and diaries that informed this episode, subscribe so we can bring you transcripts and source material in future videos. They came as prisoners and they returned as builders. That is the quiet, inconvenient power of logistics turned human.